Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and for this week's episode, I interview Andrew St. Pierre White at the Overland Expo. Andrew St. Pierre White has been overlanding and driving off-highway since 1993, and he is known for his incredible books on the subject and his travels around Africa and Australia. Andrew also has a very popular YouTube channel for 4X Overland. We had a wide-ranging conversation, including some great storytelling from Andrew about his adventures around the world. So please enjoy my conversation with the famous Andrew St. Pierre White. This content is brought to you by Overland Journal, our premium quality print publication. The magazine was founded in 2006 with the goal of providing independent equipment and vehicle reviews, along with the most stunning adventures and photography. We care deeply about the countries and cultures we visit and share our experiences freely with our readers. We also have zero advertorial policy and do not accept any advertiser compensation for our reviews. By subscribing to Overland Journal, you're helping to support our employee-owned and veteran-owned publication. Your support also provides resources and funding for content like you are watching or listening to right now. You can subscribe directly on our website at overlandjournal.com. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's such a joy to have you. I've been a long-time fan of your work. You have traveled around the world and you've produced some of the most exceptional, inspiring, and well-performing content that we've seen in the overland space. And we've got lots of questions that we're going to dig into. But the thing that I'd like to know, because I don't know that a lot of people know it, is where did you start from? Where did you grow up? What was the thing that inspired you to do this?
Well, thanks for the invitation. I really do appreciate it. My backstory is quite an easy one to tell. 12 years old, my father was a foreign correspondent working in London, so I was born in the UK. Oh. And he was invited to go to South Africa to be their correspondent there. And being an adventurous type, he decided, well, we're going to go for a holiday, family holiday, not to your normal family holiday destination, but to the Okavango. But the Okavango then, it's a wetland in the middle of the Kalahari. It's not a place where tourists go much. Mm. At the time, there were only 3 lodges in the entire area. Now there are probably 120. We drove in a Triumph 2000, which is a low-slung English-made saloon car. And I remember on the long gravel road that my knees were gradually getting closer to my chin as the belly plate of the car was being dented.
Sure.
We arrived in the Okavango. We got on board some dugout canoes, and it was a cathartic moment because I actually have a recording of me, 12 years old, this little voice, talking about the sunset, talking about the light on the water, talking about the mirror image and the shadows of the trees on the water. And I'm 12. There's something there. If I look back at it and I thought, there's the seed, there's the kernel of what I do. And that was an incredible place that is still my favorite place on the entire planet. And that was my love of the outdoors, pegged there. Several years later, my father bought a Range Rover. We went back to England for a short spell, back to South Africa with a Range Rover. And the Range Rover then, I was sent in 1974, was unique. I mean, there were literally 11 in all of Southern Africa. Yeah. Ours was actually number 11 that was imported. And this was, of course, a four-wheel drive and very capable off-road four-wheel drive. My father knew nothing. Yeah, sure. He knew nothing. But he did know enough to, well, let's put in some jerry cans because we're not going to have enough fuel. He knew that much, and some water and a tent, and 4 of us packed in this Range Rover. No roof rack, no fridge, nothing. All of our food was out of a tin can. We went back to the Okavango, but this time we drove. You can't actually drive much in the Okavango, but you can drive around it, and we again experienced it in a four-wheel drive. And this was just, it changed my life. Obviously, it changed my life. So when I turned 22, I could afford my first four-wheel drive, and of course.
And you were still living in South Africa?
Still living in South Africa, yes. I left home. I was a film editor. I was editing TV commercials, which it turned out I was quite good at. I won some awards around the world for it, even though there were South African productions, but they were entered into competitions in New York and Cannes and things like that. And I won editing awards. I was quite good at it. I loved editing. my passion out of work was expedition travel. And so I bought myself a Range Rover, of course. Of course I would.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and I was, of course, a Land Rover file. I wasn't interested in anything else. It didn't matter. It had to be a Land Rover. I did.
It's definitely an affliction, I think. I can appreciate it.
No, it absolutely is. And I built up my Range Rover and beat the living daylights out of it on some extreme expeditions with friends, and later with Gwyn, who I then married soon after that. We got together, and then I took her on an expedition, and then she absolutely loved that thing as well. So we had that connection, and we just started doing lots and lots of expeditions. And in about 91, we actually left. We literally sold our houses and everything. I sold an aeroplane. I sold editing equipment. I just sold everything but my Land Rover. Then I was driving a Land Rover 110, the predecessor to the Defender.
Sure.
I had the V8, 3.5 V8, and kept that. But we then spent 1 year in the Okavango running a lodge. And during that year, I wrote the book, The Complete Guide to Four-Wheel Drive in Southern Africa. And that book remained on sale in South Africa in different editions for 24 years nonstop from that point.
Yeah, I remember seeing the first copy that I noticed of it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the four-wheel drive store that was in Johannesburg, but I went in there and I was looking for local guides on four-wheeling. And I remember looking at a lot of your books that had lined up.
Yes.
Because that was, I think my first trip to Africa was 2010, something like that. So.
Oh, really? Even in 2010, because I left in 2013. So 2010, yes, there would have been several books of mine.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And maps too. I started a mapping company, mapping business. And the idea was existing maps didn't help remote travel enough. They were just road maps and most of the tracks were missing. So I thought, okay, no, we're going to find areas in Southern Africa that are remote, difficult to navigate through with standard maps, go out there, map them, redraw the maps from scratch with GPS coordinates. Because, of course, GPS then they weren't maps. They would just give you a latitude and longitude.
That's right.
Okay, so then you could basically look at a map and look at an intersection, read the lat and long, and on the GPS say, yeah, that looks like we're there, within a few seconds or two. The accuracy was about 300 meters, certainly close enough
for sure.
to make sure that the intersection was the one that you thought you were at. So you used it just for reference, which is still the way I use a GPS today. I glance at it and say, yeah, I'm where I think I am, but I'll use a paper map. I can't get rid of paper maps.
They're just a wonder to use. And I find that the advantage of them as well is that you stay paying attention. If you focus entirely on the GPS, people, they don't, you ask them where they're at on the map. If you take out a paper map, I got to get my GPS. Well, you should probably know. What if that thing stopped working? And they do.
And it's so true. If you are aware all of the time of your location and the direction in which you're driving, you have this big mental picture in your head. If you stare at a tiny little screen, that's all you've got in your head is a tiny little screen. And when it fails, I always say when training, you've probably seen my overlandworkshop.com. I have various training courses, and one of them I talk about navigation, and I say you've got to keep your head involved with your navigation and never turn on auto routing when in a remote area, because the GPS cannot tell the difference between something that you can do 60 miles an hour on and another that you have to go into low range. It doesn't know the difference.
Sure. And plenty of tourists around the world have gotten in trouble with that, especially in Australia. I mean, the number of Germans that seem to be dying on a regular basis in the outback in Australia.
It's quite terrifying.
It's terrifying, yeah.
The worst one was, in fact, that they found the vehicle, two deceased people. One had walked away from the vehicle, and the vehicle was engaged in four-wheel drive, but they hadn't been told that they needed to lock the front hubs because it was an old-fashioned type Land Cruiser with lockable front hubs, and didn't tell them. And they were in two-wheel drive, and they weren't even in particularly deep sand, and it cost them their lives.
Yeah, I think I've heard that story. And I even remember that all they did was lock the hubs and let a little air out of the tires, and they drove out.
That's what they did.
Yeah.
They literally did exactly that. Yeah. And they just drove the car straight out.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
So you are still in South Africa. Now, around 1991, things were starting to get fairly intense in Southern Africa. Is that part of the reason for going to the Okavango Delta, just to kind of get out of some of that intensity?
No, it was just our work had just gone on top of us. It just became so we needed that sabbatical. We needed that break from that intensity. We were living in Johannesburg, very intensive city. Yes. We just needed a break, and it was we wrote a book. Gwen and I wrote a book 10 years later. We published it 10 years later. While we were there, we kept a diary of every single day. 10 years later, Gwen, who was writing fantasy novels, who was really, really rather good writer, then took our journal and turned it into a book. And we won an award in the UK for that book.
What's the name of that book?
It's called Torn Trousers.
Okay, I've seen it. I haven't read it.
Received huge acclaim. And it's funny. And it's absolutely, when we were going through the manuscript, when we were laughing at ourselves, saying, you cannot make this stuff up. But it is all, the only adaptation we did, it's true. It's absolutely true. What Gwen did is she wove it into a story that flows really nicely. And that's all she really did. There's some very, very funny stories in it, and they're absolutely true. And that was still now, we think, one of the greatest parts of our entire lives. We still look back at it with enormous fondness.
And maybe to help the listener, because so many people admire you and look up to your work, it's always nice to hear when you have those transformative points in your life. What were the things about that year that you felt made it so special?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I think the one thing that we decided when we came back, we said, okay, we want a family, and Okavango is not a place where you have to you can bring up a family with any kind of normality. So we went back into city life, and I continued doing film editing, and then the book was published a year after we returned, the four-wheel drive book. It was so successful that we then did another. We then did a third, which was commissioned by a secondary big publishing organization. And we realized we could make a living out of this. But we made a decision. How are we going to live our lives? And there was one simple rule. None of us were going to accept that we needed to commute. We were not going to spend half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening in a car in the traffic to commute. Yeah. So whatever we did, that was the rule. And it might seem simplistic, but everything was guided around that. We wanted to take some of ourselves out of the rat race, which is what had sent us scurrying off to the Okavango to escape. We said, if we come back, we can't do the same again. If we do the same again, we'll get the same result. Do something different. So this is the rule. And we started a family, and we built a house. Actually, it was not in the city. It was kind of in the country, a bit of a drive, and it worked. And I used to travel quite frequently, and we actually then moved down to Cape Town. Beautiful place to live. Johannesburg is not my favorite place. Cape Town is a wonderful place.
Yeah, beautiful.
So we lived in Cape Town for, must have been 12 years or so. I haven't measured recently, but a significant amount of time. And we brought up our kids there and then used Cape Town as our base. Good four-wheel drive industry, which was quite small then. It's grown since significantly. And I used that as my base, and then traveled all over and did some of my longest and most exciting expeditions based from Cape Town. It was one publication after the other, maps, books, and of course I got back into film using my film skills to make South Africa's very first How to Drive a Four-Wheel Drive. It's actually on my channel. The whole thing is on my on 4X Overland YouTube channel, and How to Drive Four-Wheel Drive. And tell me if I'm wrong. I'm going to ask you a question. You'll be the right person to answer this question. I have never seen anybody do this. I think I might be the only one, and I might be wrong. When teaching people how to drive off-road, to talk about the balance, the weight balance, the center of gravity between the front and the back. In other words, if a front wheel, let's say front left wheel, has dropped into the hole, how do you get traction on that front left wheel? The best way is to lift the rear right wheel.
Yeah, to put pressure back
transferring weight forward.
Sure. As
opposed to trying to stuff stuff under the front. So I talked about weight balances, left, right. And I had some fantastic examples of, we were driving a Discovery, Mark I Discovery over some rocks, and I kept slipping out, and we kept on doing things. And I thought, this is a fantastic teaching moment. And that's what the whole video became. I would go out, research some trails, get into some interesting four-wheel drive situations. Hey, roll camera. This is a great teaching moment. And then I would teach it.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and it was great fun.
Yeah, vehicle dynamics are such a fundamental part of what we do. And you really learn them quickly under the higher speed, like racing conditions, because you have to be constantly adjusting vehicle dynamics.
And fast.
Yeah.
You're doing it at a rate of very high speed, not climbing out of the vehicle and looking at it and then making a decision. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's those drivers. That's what they do. They're constantly, if you watch F1, they're all about how do we transfer weight to the front under braking to get the vehicle to turn in. Yeah. And all those same dynamics apply off road.
Yeah. Just in slow motion.
That's right. Thankfully. Yeah. Thankfully, yeah. That's why I don't race anymore. I enjoy going more slowly now.
Okay, so, you still ride bikes a lot, though.
I do, yeah, and weight balance is a lot of that, and it's usually me becoming the weight balance, moving around on the bike. Yeah,
I edited a book for a bike rider who rode South Africa's very first motorcycling book, and we actually published it on his behalf. We worked closely together, and I read it through, and I was actually the editor. And I thought, I've got to get into motorcycling. I was captivated, but I was 50 years old. Yeah. And I thought, and then a friend of mine tried and he came off and he injured himself quite badly. And then there was somebody I knew from I think he was worked for Mitsubishi and that actually lost his life. Also, late in life, learning how to, and then going on a motorbike. And I thought, it's too late.
And
to
you have all these people in your life. You have your children and you have your wife.
Risk is okay. Yeah. Mitigate the risk. Yeah. It's not bad to take risk. That's a stupid risk because you're not 25. You're not going to learn fast enough to keep yourself safe at 50 years old on how to handle a bike.
No, that's good advice, and I think you're right.
I'll go and do something else.
Yeah, and I don't have children, and so I think I take more risks because I. Yeah. But if I did have kids, I wouldn't ride a motorcycle. They need you around at all levels, at all ages of life. So, well, that's interesting to hear about the bike. I didn't know that you had even looked into it. So, because you've been such a practitioner of the 4-wheel drive. So your books come out, your videos come out, and you start to plan these longer trips. So, what was your first really long distance overland adventure that you did that comes to mind?
That would have been Botswana with friends. We had 2 Range Rovers, both similar age. Both mine was a 71 and his was a 73. To Botswana, we did the classic Botswana Chobe Marimi route that everybody does. Yeah. But then
third what is it? Third Bridge and all that.
Yeah, sure. Actually, my dad and I went to Third Bridge in his Range Rover 974. That's amazing. That was the first time we had ever been there. So, but then my vehicle, my trip, our trip was then in 87. I think it was 86. And then we did another one in 87. We circumnavigated the Okavango and then crashed. I don't know. There's quite a well-known story on the channel. We had a semi-head-on collision on a bush track with a Toyota Land Cruiser. It goes without saying the Land Cruiser won. The whole Range Rover's bonnet was literally ripped off its hinges, but I rebuilt the front of the Range Rover in the bush with parts I had. I used to carry a case of wire and epoxy putty and bolts and nuts and little bits of bar, threaded bar, nuts, you name it. Just a mishmash of stuff. By the time I got that car running, no bonnet. All the bonnet was gone. Front bumper was bent back, destroyed a wheel rim. The battery had been crushed, but I was carrying 2 batteries, one for a winch. So I used the secondary battery. Even used I had quite a heavy hammer underneath the radiator, wedged it in with wire so I could lift the radiator up, and then a strut that I removed from somewhere else in the Range Rover to make sure that the radiator didn't fall back and hit the fan, because it was a steel fan. It would have just chewed a hole in the radiator.
Yeah, sure.
And we drove it a little more than 1,000 miles all the way home, and only ever actually stopped once.
Amazing.
The guys at the border post were looking very strangely at this car with no bonnet.
Yeah.
And they said, "What happened?" I said, "Oh, your roads are so bad, it just fell apart." And the guy actually believed me for a moment.
Yeah, because you wouldn't really want to tell him that you had an accident.
Well, actually, the cops came and took some statements. They were very civilized, and we explained to them, and then we just thought, okay, we're going to drive it home, and we might get stopped a few times. Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And we got all the way home. And I called it the Strange Rover because it had no front end.
So at some point, we'll switch over to vehicles for a minute because this will be a fun one. At some point, you transitioned, at least partially, from your love for Land Rovers to a love for Toyotas. What was your first Toyota, or I guess your first non-Land Rover vehicle that you took on trips?
I was invited to a lot of press events, particularly by Toyota South Africa, who had read the book and saw my publications and thought, we need to get this guy out of his Land Rover. And I loved my Defender. It was fantastic. Sure. I still love that car for different reasons that I love other cars, but it was fantastic and it worked very, very well for us. the marketing director came and said, would you like a long-term loan of the Land Cruiser 90? That was called the Prado. It was the second generation Prado. It was the 90. It had a 3-liter turbo diesel motor. And he said, what would you do? And, fantastic. And I took it for a run, took it for a month and thought, this is good. This is a good car. It's not going to match the Land Rover off-road. It easily surpasses it on-road. Mm-hmm. It uses far less fuel. It's far more comfortable. Yeah. It doesn't have the payload. But then again, my vehicles were light. Mm. I was never close to maximum payload on my Land Rover, even on the heaviest trips. Yeah. I was really, really light. So weight wasn't an issue. And I put a rooftop tent on it and did some trips in it. And Toyota was my friend. And they were very, very happy. I drowned that car. It was the first time I had actually drowned a car off-road. I had been told, drive it off-road, do your stuff. That's the only mandate we have. Just continue doing what you're doing. Take lots of pictures of our car. That's it. You can have it for a whole year. And I was driving in very, very deep water, very carefully. And I messed it up. I mean, it was my fault completely. And idiot, it's the kind of thing that you look at other people and say, moron. Okay.
We've all had those moments.
We've all had those moments. And then I remember climbing out and the Engel fridge that was in the back was floating. And it blew a fuse in the Engel fridge. It actually continued working afterwards. And then I was driving with a friend of mine who was a diesel mechanic, and I knew what to do to clear the motor, because as it stopped, my hands reached for the ignition, and this little voice said to me, no, stop. And I why am I trying to start it? You're an idiot. Now you really are an idiot if you try and start it.
Sure.
So I then climbed out, full of water and everything, and we hauled the 90 out. This friend of mine, diesel mechanic, said, no, he showed me how to clear a motor of water. Yeah. And interestingly enough, put it in fifth gear, lift up one of the back wheels, put it in with a closed center diff.
And then
rotate.
Yeah, sure.
Rotate the back wheel by hand. Uh-huh. But we've taken out all of the glow plugs.
Yeah, sure.
And then to the cylinders had water in them. If I had cracked, motor would have bent.
Yeah, sure.
So out came all the water. We took out the air cleaner. We removed it completely to let it dry and drove about a kilometre back to the camp. And then the next morning refitted the air filter that had dried in the sun. And I thought, what a great teaching moment that was. Yeah. I would have done something similar, but not that well. That was really smart because he understood the mechanics and probably had done it before. So there you go.
Another advantage of the manual transmission.
Indeed.
If it had been an automatic.
Oh, no, it was auto.
Yeah.
It was a manual. Yeah. We would have been...
It would have been a lot more...
We would have found another... We would have had to use a starter. You would have had to use a starter. But he was saying it's so much more gentle on the engine, just to turn it and rock it.
That's right.
Rock it, and eventually it starts turning. You can feel the motor turning, and it's gentle. It's mechanical sympathy.
Yeah, I actually watched an interesting video. It was a 70 series, and they put it up on a bottle jack. Starter had failed, and they wrapped a recovery strap around the wheel. So all the other wheels were on the ground, and bunch of guys, they ran with the strap, spun the wheel, and it started the motor. It's fantastic.
I've seen people do that on a C47, the Dakota. Yeah. Wrapping a rope around the propeller boss on a Dakota, and like 6 guys. 1, 2, 3, go. And this great big radial started.
Incredible.
But if you think of the gearing, the boss is only 30. It's a foot wide or so, maybe a bit longer. But that's the gearing of this enormous propeller, and they started it. That was fantastic.
And there's even a really neat story of this solo sailor, and the engine. They lost the starter on the engine, and he used the main sheet, all the mechanical advantage on a sailboat. So he let the mainsail swing with the wind, which went through a series of pulleys and started the diesel engine.
That is so brilliant.
Fantastic?
That is fantastic.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
it when people figure that. Yes, exactly. And I think that's one of the joys of what we do, is that you're constantly solving problems.
Yeah.
And for some people, that's terrifying. I think that they romanticize the idea of overlanding, but when you get out there, it's an adventure, which means things are going wrong.
Yeah.
You're constantly overcoming little challenges.
Absolutely. Lots of little ones. Hopefully no big ones.
Yeah. Well, and the big ones can happen too. And that's part of the risk of that. Oh, speaking of that, have you felt like that there was any big events that have occurred, like other than the accident with the Land Cruiser, that you felt like you learned a lot from?
Yes, I was in the 90 and I was doing a trip on a place, one of my favorite places called the Makadikari salt pans. It's a very, very broad, it's the second biggest salt pan in the world. It's in the middle of Botswana, middle of the Kalahari. And we had tried to get to a place called Kokonya Island. And I'd been there once before, knew that the mud conditions could be tricky, and we decided to give it a go. And we were on our own. And in retrospect, not a great idea. Anyway, dropped the tire pressures down, headed in a straight line. There was a fence line, and they hadn't finished the fence line. There were some poles, and I remember the poles became significant later. Because the trouble is with that mud, as it clings to the tires, it literally clings to the tires. So your wheels get bigger and bigger and bigger. Then it's a case of saying to yourself, I wish I hadn't done this, but it's too late now because if I stop, I'm bellied. So I've got these clops of mud flying past the windscreen, thinking I shouldn't have done this. There was some tussock grass, and I thought, I'm going to stick. But if I can stick on the tussock grass, I can at least keep air underneath the vehicle and not have this vacuum problem.
Sure.
Which worked. I got onto the tussock grass, and the tussock grass held the vehicle aloft. It got stuck, but at least I didn't have this vacuum formed when a vehicle bellies.
Sure.
I got out, and it was incredibly hot. White surface. And I had the day before overdone it a bit with my photography and things. And I had made myself a bottle of rehydrant because I could identify a little bit of a dehydration issue, and possibly a sunstroke. So I realized that I was in a delicate decision. So when this happened, I thought, you're even more of an idiot now because you're on your own and you probably shouldn't have done this. Now you're stuck. And I said to my companion, I said, we're going to have one try. Because as the vehicle stopped, I shouted to him, the poles. And he knew exactly what I was talking about. We needed those poles that were about 200 meters behind us to put under the vehicle to stop it sinking, because we knew that if it had bellied, we were finished.
Yeah, sure.
We ran back, we got the poles. So by the time the poles were underneath the vehicle, and we didn't actually need them to stop the vehicle sinking. We used them as today we've got max tracks. Yeah. No such thing at the time. We used them as traction aids, so they did help our recovery. But the running back and the running forward, the heat, my condition, I said to him, we're going to have one try. And if this doesn't work, we're building a shelter. We've got a shade net. We're going to build a shelter, and we're going to sit. We're going to sip the water, and we're going to wait until we've got a full moon tonight, and we'll pull it out at night. Yeah. We got it out first try.
And you had a winch on board? Or we
had no winch on board. We had a high lift, and which would have been a hell of a lot. And that's what we were going to use, the high lift, and push the vehicle off lift it, shift, push, and we were going to lift it up and push it onto the poles. And but anyway, I won't go into too much detail in the story. But for the fact that when we finally got out, because of course we had got some seed netting, our grass net hadn't worked very well, and we were overheating, not massively, but we were overheating because some grass had got through it and into the radiator. Yeah. I learned a lot about seed nets then too.
Yeah. And you need those in Australia for sure.
Yeah. And the front of the vehicle is not the most important part. It's underneath. And that was the mistake we made. Most of the seeds got in from underneath, not from straight on.
Sure.
So it was a learning moment as well. And I realized that was, risk mitigation. If you're going to take a risk, think about it and how do you get out? If this goes pear-shaped, what are you going to do and have a plan in mind? Don't just see the wild blue yonder and say, let's go. It could be a bit sticky. It's 103 outside.
Yeah, sure.
And it was our last day, and we had less than 20 liters of water for the two of us. So we were also a bit low on water. You've got to, So that was a learning moment. Again, a really important learning moment. And that was probably in 98, somewhere around there.
Yeah. And then I don't remember the year, but somewhere in the early 2000s, you were looking to leave South Africa and move. I think you moved back maybe to the UK first?
In 2013.
Yeah.
I moved back to the UK, mainly because I had a television show going in South Africa for 9 years. I had a series. Mm-hmm. It was becoming more and more difficult to produce that series because the broadcasters were asking more and more money for us to broadcast it. It's not as if you produce a show and then they will pay you for it. No, they will pay you to broadcast it. And it became untenable. And I spent all my time looking for sponsors.
Sure.
And so little time actually making creative content. And I thought, I've got a great body of work. I could probably get some really good, significant work in the UK, which turned out to be wrong. But the UK move was good. But in terms of my kids, the future in South Africa didn't look good for them. And economically, it was falling apart. The president at the time was a basket case and stealing all the money from the economy, and the country socially and economically was a really difficult place to live. And I thought, I want something better for my kids. Moved to England in 2013 and didn't like it at all.
Yeah.
Didn't like it at all. I think the weather was the most thing. The weather and the number of people was, it got us down from living in Africa. And we did kind of say, what on earth have we done?
Yeah.
And then because my mother is an Australian and I had Australian citizenship, I then applied for residency for the rest of my family, for the 3 girls and Gwen, obviously. And we were granted it a year and a half later. We were granted it, and we moved to Australia. And Australia is fantastic.
It really is a beautiful country and beautiful people.
Fantastic. Very
special.
The politicians are just as annoying as anywhere in the world.
Yes. Every other place.
But as a country, as a people, as a place to be, and as a place to overland.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic place to overland.
There's so much of it. I mean, just getting to Alice Springs, it's an adventure. Just getting there from Britain. And where are you located in
north of Perth?
Oh, Perth. Okay,
Western Australia.
Got it. Oh, I did a wonderful trip. The last time I was in Australia, we did all off-road along the Great Australian Bight. So we did the whole southern part of the country. And it's very remote there. I mean, incredible sand dunes, absolutely brilliant white, massive sand dunes along that coastline too. Yeah. Very cool.
Very, very nice.
Yeah.
You'll know that road because in 2020, during the height of COVID, of course, we couldn't leave. I bought this old Range Rover. And to kind of relive my old past. And kind of that. It was.
You have your midlife crisis?
In effect, that was my midlife crisis. I bought an old Range Rover. I went to Melbourne. It was a 75 model. It was in reasonable shape. Spent 4 days working on it, and then drove it unsupported all the way across Australia along that road you're talking about. But I didn't go off-road. I stayed on road. I was going to be sensible. And then, of course...
Isn't that called the Nullarbor?
The Nullarbor.
So you did the Nullarbor Highway, which is... Yes. I don't think that's any less dangerous than the pavement or than the off-road because there's nobody out there.
And then you take those side roads down to the Bight. The roads go right to the cliff edge. So I drove the Range Rover. And here's an interesting story. Before I bought the Range Rover, I went looking for my original one in South Africa.
Okay.
And somebody who's obviously nutty about Range Rovers communicated with me and said, well, I know about your car. It was scrapped, gave me a date, and I have the original builder's plate of my original Range Rover. I thought, that's fantastic. Will you sell it to me? He said, yes. And I think it was £100 or whatever. And I said, I bought it from him. And then on the Bight, on the Nullarbor, opened the package. I had not opened the package. I'd taken it with me, but I had not opened the package. And on the Nullarbor with my new old Range Rover, opened the builder's plate and kind of showed it up. And there was my new Range Rover. And there was my old builder's plate.
Oh, I love it.
Kind of closed the story.
Well, you've had a lot of different vehicles from all of that experience. What would you say is your top 3? The 3 that if someone was to say, and they could somehow get any one of these vehicles, what would you recommend? What would be your top 3?
Land Cruiser 78 Troop Carrier, because it's light, compact, really strong, proper off-road four-wheel drive, and being a compact van, you can kind of live in and out of it. So if the weather really gets bad, you can actually, make a meal or certainly get comfortable inside it, or even chill out inside of it if the weather gets bad. And the Troopy is a lovely combination. And all these cars, there are good points and bad points. The Troopy is no exception, but it's got so many good points. Yeah. The trouble is when you buy it off the showroom, which is becoming more and more difficult, it's a very basic car. It's very basic. And that in a way is nice because you've taken this very basic platform and it's not nice to drive. Let's put it this way. The ride is awful, but it doesn't cost very much to make the ride really quite acceptable. Sure. You fix up the interior, do good battery systems and good hot water systems. At this age, I need a good shower. Sure. Many years ago, it didn't worry me. Now, if I'm in the bush, I want a shower. Sure. But you can now have a good shower easily. Yeah. And so I'm building in these systems to make camping and overlanding comfortable. And is that your current vehicle? Is a 78? I actually have 2. Nice. I have 2 78s. I've just bought one in Africa. Oh, so nice. I have my 78 V8 in Australia, And there's a series running currently on my channel. I took the risk and bought a 500,000 kilometer Land Cruiser troop carrier, 78 troop. This one is the 1HZ, the 4.2 diesel
simple.
motor.
Yeah,
very simple motor. But I can't pull the skin off a rice pudding is an expression other people have used, but it's very underpowered. Very reliable, simple. Paul Marsh and I are now building it in Cape Town. So I went over and we spent 7 days working on it, doing all the mechanicals. He's now doing a build for the interior. So I've got 2 troop carriers. So I like troop carriers.
Well, and speaking of Paul Marsh, he's one of the most exceptional human beings I have ever met in my life. I mean, he is not only incredibly accomplished as an overland traveler, several Trans-Africa trips, and he actually helped us prepare the 78 series for Antarctica.
Right. Yes.
So he helped us get it lifted and the big tires on it and everything.
Extremely highly qualified individual.
And he's humble and just incredibly competent.
He's a great teacher because he's the co-teacher on Overland Workshop. He's the co-presenter. So we came together and we said, we've done so much content teaching people. We need to put it a place where everybody can find all of it, and it's in different courses.
Well, Paul was a great choice for that.
Yeah,
he is someone that I just genuinely admire. So I'm looking forward to seeing him soon. The 78 series was your first choice, which is, I think that's a great one. What would be number 2?
Number 2 is the Mercedes Geländewagen, but specifically the 461 series.
Yeah, big difference.
Massive difference. They're not the same car. They might look similar. They're not the same. The 461 is I had 2. My last one was a NATO spec. So it had the taller wheels. It had the taller springs and very, very, like the Troopy, very, very basic. But it had the front and rear lockers. And there's something uncanny about the G-Wagon's ability over rough ground. Yeah. And I loved I'd get another one tomorrow. I wouldn't use it as an overlander because actually the Troopy's better as an overlander.
A little more space.
Yeah, it's more space, more practical, but the G is fantastic car. I used to go.
That was the car I owned the longest. I know. Over 12 years.
Yes, you did. And I remember when you
really enjoyed it.
When you sold it. I used to arrive at my friend's game farm in Natal. It was a 5-kilometer run from the main road down to the camp on the river, but it was rough track. And I would literally brace myself in the seat, take a little bit of weight off my bum and hammer it down that road. And the G-Wagon would track absolutely brilliantly. Like, you couldn't do that in a troop carrier. It would be thrown all over the place. The G would just track. It was marvelous.
The breadth of capability in that vehicle is quite incredible. All right, so that's number 2. What's number 3?
Number 3 is more difficult because I've got in the back of my mind, if I had to build something.
What does your heart say? What if you had to buy one with your heart, not your head?
Right now, I did. I bought an old 2-door Range Rover.
That's perfect. I think that's a great number 3.
It's a plaything. It's nothing more than a plaything. So that would be number 3. That would definitely be number 3. Yeah.
Oh, those old Range Rovers are just beautiful. I didn't know this until somewhat recently, but it's the only automobile that's ever been in the Louvre.
Yes, it is.
Because of the design of that thing was so exceptional. Yeah. And even today, it is such a handsome vehicle to behold. Yeah, they're just my favorite. I think the old ones are better too. I had a 95 soft dash, and it was just at the start of it being so complex that it was pretty much unusable.
I had the same one. I had a 96 soft dash.
Pretty much unusable.
And I didn't keep it for long because it was getting too complicated.
Yeah, just too complicated for sure. If someone was to come to you new to overlanding and they've said, okay, I've just purchased a 78 series Troopy, what are the top 3 or 4 or 5 things that you would recommend that people, not so much like as a luxury, but what are the things that people need to get started?
So I would always say, no matter what vehicle, I think it's probably more difficult to answer it saying if it's a troop carrier, because the first thing you might do with a troop carrier is just make it nicer to drive by changing the suspension and putting some decent tires on it. But I like to teach the principle of a least flexible, most flexible. So when you just look at a vehicle and you say, okay, even before you buy it, what do I need? And make 2 lists, most flexible and least flexible. So for example, if you're simple example as possible, I have my partner and I have 2 kids. So what's going to be least flexible? I need 4 comfortable seats. Top of the least flexible list. Everything else has a place on those lists. Well, it's only 2 of us, but I might want to take a friend, so maybe I'll put a 3rd seat in. Well, is that really important thing for you, if it's a really important thing to put in the third seat, then put it on the top of the least flexible list.
Yeah.
But if it's I would like it, well, then it's going to come further down the list, isn't it? So that when you've built the car, you don't look at it and say, I really messed up because I forgot about the third person that I was thinking would be. How important is that third person? So you then start saying, I now know what I want because I've given this process of least flexible, most flexible, some thought, and I have these lists.
Yeah.
And it's okay to change them. But the principles, those things that stay at the top of least flexible in a vehicle build will stay there. And the other things might move about a bit as you go through the build.
That makes sense.
And actually you do that and you'll end up with a car that you wanted.
And I think that it's also so important, and we do this on the podcast all the time, is just to remind people that there's a difference between needs and wants. And most of the time you need a lot less than you think. I mean, once you get a good set of tires and a decent recovery kit so you can get yourself unstuck, and a decent little toolkit and some basic spares, and a way to communicate if you get into real bad trouble, you're pretty much ready to go.
Yeah.
Just about anywhere in the world.
I'm glad you mentioned tires. Actually, it's the first thing.
Yeah.
Tires. Just forget it. It doesn't
Especially
matter.
a 78. The tires they come with are almost unusable.
I drove all the way from Johannesburg down to Cape Town with these tires. And we actually did a little off-road drive. Yeah. And the Prado in front of me was actually pulling a trailer, quite a light trailer. And he was wandering in front of us, no problem at all. I couldn't get through.
I know.
I had to really drive it really well to get it through, just because of these terrible tires.
Yeah.
So
it was the same for us when we built the E7 trucks. I took it out for some baseline testing, and I thought that the vehicle was broken. It would not go through the obstacle with the diff locks on it. Everything. It was all four tires were just spinning no grip at all. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
amazing actually that they sell them like that.
Yeah, I know. I think they're just a commercial vehicle. They're just such a basic, functional commercial vehicle.
Yeah, and the one we bought was obviously used by mine as a may have been an ambulance or something. I'm not sure, but anyway, it was not loved. But it was in better condition than we thought. But it was definitely not loved.
I know, though. Africa is, and so is Australia. Those two environments are very abusive on vehicles. You know, we find in North America that our routes are shorter, but they tend to be more technical. But the speeds are much lower. So if you drive along a corrugated road at 80 kilometers an hour for 1,000 kilometers, that's an enormous amount of abuse on the vehicle. Whereas if you drive, 10 miles of rock crawling and you're going slow and gentle, it seems to actually be easier on the car.
It is. I think so. And Australia has the most brutal corrugations I've ever found anywhere.
Yeah, you could bury this coffee mug inside of one and not see it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's astonishing how rough they can be. And then sometimes you get to the point where, when you hit corrugations and you say, okay, I've got to find a comfortable speed here, because the speed will allow, it's like planing a boat.
Sure.
You get the wheels to ride over the corrugations. But the trouble is sometimes to get to that speed, the car is being shaken to pieces.
Absolutely.
And then you get to that speed, and sometimes the speed is actually too high.
Yeah.
It might be 75, 80 kilometers an hour, and you realize this is not the kind of track you really want to do 80 on. Mm-hmm. So then you slow down, and then the car wants to shake itself to pieces. So what do? 10 miles an hour.
Yeah.
To preserve the car
and yourself in many ways. I mean, and the other challenge is you air down low enough where that starts to help, but then the tires start to overheat. It's hot in Australia.
You've got to limit the amount you let them down. You
can only go so low.
Yeah, and I always feel the tire. I just get out and it's a habit. Feel the tires.
Absolutely, and they get hot.
And if they're warmer than a warm coffee mug, they're too hot.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about filmmaking, because one of the things that I find so impressive about what you do is that most of the films that you've produced, these incredible adventures, you have self-produced them. You are the presenter, you are the expedition leader, you are the cameraman, you are the audio guy, you're the DIT, you handle all of the downloading, the backups, and then you also not only edit it, but then you produce it, market it, and get it out to the world. A lot of people that are listening would probably love to be able to do a better job of capturing their own stories. And now that social media allows for so many people to share their own experiences, what are some pieces of advice that you would give to someone trying to self-produce? What kind of camera should they consider? How should they capture it? Maybe just a couple pieces of advice, because you've become a master at it.
Keep the camera equipment simple. Keep it as simple as you possibly can. All of this fancy gimbal stuff, so you're taking 10 minutes to set up for a shot, and by the time you've got the shot, the sun's gone down.
Yeah.
You know, you're shooting most of your stuff in the last 2 hours of the day and the first hour or so in the morning, maybe 2. Try and keep it there because that's where the light is. Light is everything. Light is everything. Okay.
Yeah, light then location, yeah.
But in terms of storytelling, audio is everything. All my stories are led by the audio track because the audio track is the intellectual information. The video is the stimulation, the visible stimulation. So information stimulation.
Yeah, sure.
And I run courses as well on beafilmmaker.com, and I do one thing that I
don't mean to interrupt, but is beafilmmaker.com, is that another one of your properties?
Yes,
okay, and you have stories and information about what we're talking about now.
Exactly.
Oh, so if people want to find out more,
there are 5 courses on storytelling and filmmaking and videography and things like that.
So for those that are listening, beafilmmaker.com, you'll be able to,
word, yes.
Yeah, you'll be able to find out more about what we're talking about now. That's great.
And I presented, and actually at the Overland Expo in the past, I've done lessons on it, and I will say, I'm going to teach you 5 things today that you need to know. But you only need to remember 2. And it doesn't matter which 2 you remember. When you walk out of here, just remember at least 2 of these things. Okay, I'm going to reveal all 5 to you now, and they're all exactly the same. Audio is more important than video. Oh. They're all exactly the same. If you remember that, you'll be a good storyteller because it's led by the audio. It's led by emotion. It's led by not by visuals. Visuals are treats. The audio is the story.
And you have, first of all, you have a British accent, so. You know, does
that help?
I think it helps a lot. I think it helps a lot. I mean, I have a face for radio. At least I've got a
face for radio. Good one.
I do have a voice that projects well, but there is something about a British accent and then your enthusiasm that comes across in your film to camera. You're so excited about wherever you're at. 30 years later, you're equally excited. And I think that it's infectious. It makes people excited to listen to you.
Here's the rule. If I'm not excited, keep the camera in its box. Well, you've got to be genuinely excited.
Yeah,
I'm hopeless at putting on excitement.
Yeah.
I'm either excited or I'm not. And if I'm not interested in the place and the place is boring, well, then it's going to be boring to my viewers as well. If it's boring to me, it's going to be boring to them. It's not about getting content and filling up space in time.
Sure.
It's about telling a story and getting people inspired. And when I'm inspired, it's easy as anything to inspire somebody else. Because I'm inspired. So I just point the camera at myself and start rabbiting on about something or other, fill it with some nice images, and I get a good story, a reasonable story at the end of it. But you have shoots that I come away from saying, that was just absolutely brilliant. It was just this is why I do this. And you get other times where it was, that's okay. Not all are really as good as, they're not as good as the best. And I shot something last year called The Friends Crossing the Canning. And it was the best work I've done in 10 years or more. And
is that one of your favorite pieces that you've produced?
So I've crossed the Canning stock route, which is a route of, you think about this is a bit difficult for many people to appreciate.
I love this route. It's so great.
You've done part of it. You've done the northern part of it.
I did the whole thing.
Did you do the whole thing? Yeah. Okay. So here's the deal. 1,000 miles off road.
Yeah. And there's only one place to get fuel along the way.
That's my favorite track. And of course I did it in 2017. It was my first outback trip in Australia, which was pretty ambitious, but I took Paul with me. I knew I was in safe hands mechanically. But we built a good vehicle just before that trip, and I kept that vehicle for several years. And then I did it with the old Range Rover. So the old 45-year-old Range Rover. Somebody said, "Why didn't you take it on the Canning?" As he said it, I thought, I want to smash your head in. You've now put this, how can we take this old Land Rover on that vehicle breaker? Yeah. Is this crazy? But you've sown the seed. I can't let it go.
Yeah.
And he was one of the chaps that actually came on the trip. I said to him, you have to come. This is all your fault. And if this goes pear-shaped, I'm going to blame you.
Yeah.
And it was a magnificent trip. And the Range Rover, and here's the funny thing about that whole story. The Range Rover did give us some problems. Not too many, because it's so simple. The vehicle that everybody thought, including ourselves, that would sail it, the Hilux, gave us endless problems.
Oh, wow.
So there's the story. So I do these gratuitous pans of the Hilux, which is broken. It's got its back wheels off and there's a brake problem. And I pan onto the Range Rover, which is sitting with its bonnet closed, happy as a clam, and I play the music, Land of Hope and Glory. Just to stick it to Heine, who was driving the Hilux, who was getting more and more ticked off with us because we kept on giving him a hard time. But he would play it back to us. We lost the Range Rover's lights. We had to do some night driving because we'd lost a lot of time. We decided to do a bit of night driving. And the Range Rover's lights, the actual switch disintegrated. It literally, the interior it didn't melt, it just fell apart.
Sure.
So he was so happy when the Range Rover broke down. And then Rob, who was the English guy that was driving the Range Rover most of the route, pointed out that if the Hilux hadn't broken down, we wouldn't have needed to have driven at night. It was a great story. Wonderful.
So the Canning Stock route film that you just, and is that out for people to watch now?
So there are episodes, there are about 3 episodes on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay. But the full series, the full 13-part series, is actually on video on demand on Vimeo. So if you find it on the channel, you'll see links in the description of all the videos. Okay. And then you can download and I promise you it's infectious. It gets, every episode is a little better and a little funnier. And I'll get a tiny little spoiler here. The last bit of shooting we did on the last day, which was the wrap up, the 4 of us were camped somewhere. This was after we got back, a month after we got back. We were talking about how great the trip was. And what was your best moment? What was your best moment? What was your best moment? And the Range Rover was parked on the edge of this like a little green hill. And this rainbow appeared. And I'm not kidding. It looks like Hollywood production. This massive double-edged rainbow goes all the way over and the Range Rover is right in the middle. And as they were talking, I said, that's my end shot. And actually, you can hear me saying, that's my end shot. And I grabbed the camera and I leave it running. And I just pointed at the Range Rover with this. That was our final shot of the series. How was that for serendipity? I mean, it was just, the gods of cinema were saying, yeah, I'm going to give you this one, mate.
Oh, well, so then what is another series that you think people would really, or one that you're most favorite? One of your favorites?
My most favorite is in 2010, I decided to relive my boyhood dream of finding the source of the Okavango, because the Okavango was the source of my love of off-road and overland and wilderness. And I would go and find its source, but the source is in Angola. And I could find no information anywhere about the source of the Okavango. I knew it was on the Kabango River in Angola, and we would go and find it. So I did a solo trip across the entire Namib Desert on my own in my 105 Land Cruiser, which is actually my third favorite vehicle.
Yeah,
if I
it's
talked
such a
about
special car.
Fantastic. It's the 100 body with an 80 series chassis. What a fantastic combination that is.
And the 1HZ, so it's such a simple motor.
And I had a 1HZ, absolutely. We then did that, and it was a 66-day expedition. And I was joined by people in Angola after I'd done my solo trip through the Namib, and they took us into Angola, which is just mind-blowing. Just the colors, the textures, the smell. It's just beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. And then into Botswana, and we followed the Okavango River. And the amazing thing was, we followed it from its very, very source, the highest point in the valley. I took some water from that little pool and decided that I would empty it at the end of the river, because, of course, that river never finds the sea. It finds the Okavango. But after it finds the Okavango, it spills out into the Boteti and Nabe rivers, and we felt the Boteti is the longest of those rivers, and we followed the Boteti until it ended, and it literally stopped in a riverbed. But it was moving at probably quarter mile an hour as this water was trickling. We stopped. We jumped out of the car and said, there's the end of the river. Some villagers had come down. They hadn't seen water in that river for 25 years. And they were marveling at the fact that this water had now arrived. Most of the people standing there had never, ever, they were younger than 25 years old, had never seen water in that river. So we got filming, and I poured the water slightly ahead of the water advancing down the river, and kind of just poured it ahead and watched the two meet, and kind of I made the river a tiny bit longer with this bottle of water that I'd captured. That, to me, I think that moment in overlanding, that one moment is the kind of culmination of my career. It was a fantastic series. It got broadcast that series got broadcast in a lot of countries. It was probably my best work. That and the canning that I've recently done, my best work.
And what's the name of the series on the Okavango?
It's called It's in Search of the Source of the Okavango.
Okay.
And it's also on Vimeo Video on Demand. And if you go onto Vimeo on Demand and you type in Andrews and Pierre White, you'll probably find it.
Okay.
If not, again, YouTube, you'll find links there.
So one of the things that I like to ask, it's more of a selfish question, is what are you've written many books yourself, but what are your top 2-3 books that you have enjoyed in your life on any subject?
I love audiobooks. And when I'm traveling, I gobble them up.
Yeah, me too.
Into Thin Air, John Krakauer.
It's a good one.
I've listened to it about 4 times. I love history, but I'm quite selective on my historians. I love war history. Max Hastings is a favorite of mine. I just finished a book called Nemesis, which was the USA and Japan conflict that ended in 1945. And he's a very even-handed historian. You know, he's English, but he doesn't keep waving the Union Jack all the time. And you know, he seems to be very balanced, and I really like his work. Other books, I don't have any particular favorites, but I because I've collected comedy all my life. One of the best autobiographies I've ever read, Eric Idle, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, and it's not about Monty Python. It's and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful.
That's a great suggestion.
And the book that I've just put down now is called Unnatural Causes. I can't remember the author's name actually, but it's basically a pathologist. And he was kind of the top pathologist in the UK, and was actually called to as an acting British pathologist after the 9/11 tragedy. And so his story about dead people, but it's so well written, and it's absolutely captivating. What a job that is.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, it has been a joy to have you on the podcast. It's so great to see you again. I think the last time that we spent time together was, I think it might have been at the Aventura in Allred, but maybe slightly before that was at the Overland Expo at Mormon Lake.
That's right.
We got to have a conversation.
I think it was Allred. It was 15, I think.
Yeah,
I had my trippy. I drove my trippy my trippy that I built in South Africa, then imported it into the UK, and then actually sold it there. But before I sold it, I actually took it to Aventura.
Yeah,
and it was so interesting because all of the guys, because that that camper conversion, I actually designed it. So all the other guys from Tom's and Extreme all came around. You know, can we take pictures? And I said, well, I don't own the design. Go for it. Make yourself at home. And it was nice to see that they adapted quite a few of my ideas into their things. Well, it was quite nice to see.
How do people find out more about you? Let's talk about where they find you on the web, on social media. So
my website is 4xoverland.com. And on there are several badges, points of, and my videos, my courses, all of the things that I do. I also involved in a company called Egon. We've seen myself teamed up with a mechatronics engineer. We're seeing shortcomings and needs in the electrical fitment parts of four-wheel drives and campers and things. So we developed some products there. But that's the best place to find me is 4xoverland.com. And from there are lots of links to all of the many things I do. And of course, Instagram is 4xoverland _com is my Instagram channel.
Nice.
That's me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to see you. Hopefully I'll bump into you on another continent soon, maybe in Africa. You never know.
Well, I'm there next April.
Okay.
To take our Africa cruiser on its very first trip.
Oh, fantastic.
And we're planning on Malawi and Zambia and Malawi.
Oh,
that's
beautiful.
What we're planning.
Well, thank you again, Andrew. And we thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.